Yeah, Boaz.
And Dave, before we get into some of your models for predicting the future and indeed how successfully they've predicted the past, I'd like to dive in to some of your very bold predictions about the future, specifically regarding World War III, the status of the dollar as a global reserve currency, and the UK's place in the future.
Big start then. Well, basically, part of my thesis is a 5-stage of empire model, which in 2002, when I created it, implied and predicted that America was in terminal decline, the 5th stage, and highlighted that journey towards decline. And at the same time, it highlighted that China was the second of the Asian super empires and was in expansion. And it would move into the gap aggressively to create a hegemonic challenge.
As it did.
And sequentially, the peak of that hegemonic challenge will come at the next commodity cycle peak in 2025 to 27. And wars are not fought idealistically, they're fought over resources. And commodity resource spikes are in effect the drumbeat of conflict. So my conclusion back then was these two systems would rise to equality, there would be hegemonic challenge, and the great risk for conflict, global conflict, would be 2025, maybe slightly early from 24 to 27, and somewhere in that band we would have a human systems threat of World War III unless certain steps were taken. And those steps really result in deterrence. So recognizing where China is, which it has a time frame for its hegemonic challenge to be completed by 2030, much earlier than people realize, because of its negative demographics and because of the rise of India. And India representing the same strategic threat as Russia did to Germany twice, as in it forced the timing of when Germany acted and went to war in 14 and 39, 40, and obviously invading Russia. India has the same role. So the conclusion is that Xi understands that time frame and that he knows what he's doing. And part of that process for the Chinese was to dupe the West into thinking that if we invested in their capital structure, we gave them the things that we valued, they would be like us. And it's amazing how many people don't really understand how Deng's plan was to do that. And they're now in a different phase, which is they don't need us to invest in them. In fact, they're busy chopping off every investor's fingers quietly at the moment because they've shifted to another model, which is much like the Nazi 4-year plan, an internally fueled consumer society that militarizes and starts its road to an accelerated point of conflict, all of which we've seen evolve in the past year or so. So we've got a very sleepy West. Yes, Biden's focusing on China, but he's not doing the things that require us to combat them, which is a full isolation, an Iron Curtain type structure, new supply chains that are away from China, new manufacturing systems, all those things urgently needed, and very large investments in the appropriate military responses. The failure to create a proper Navy plan, a US Navy plan in his administration is really concerning because the US Navy is the front line in containment. So there are many signals that Biden is giving. And in that process, that's really key, is all the great conflicts before have had things called pilot wars. And those pilot wars are these little conflicts that no one notices, like the Boer War was to Britain and in South Africa, and to Germany that was in hegemonic early phase, shall we challenge mode, watching us fail to bring the Boer farmers to Brook over a period of years and taking 500,000 English soldiers to do it was a sign of weakness. And that begat the arms race when the Dreadnought was launched, and the whole thing came about because it was really a failed pilot war in the time it took to prosecute and be successful. If you look at the Spanish Civil War, it was a similar pilot war. It sort of represented that Britain and France just left Spain to its own devices, let the communists fight with the Nazis or the fascists, and they just left it. That was a sign of weakness, and certainly a failure to push Germany out of the Ruhr when they moved into the Rhinelands in March 36 was a massive signal. And conversely, a positive example was the Falklands War. The Falklands War changed the perspective of the Kremlin. The capitalists were weak, and one day their large army would roll into Europe, and essentially capitalism would fall. And suddenly this thing called Britain under Thatcher that had nuclear weapons went 8,000 miles and determinedly fought for its territory. And it irrevocably changed their perspective in the use of force. And that's why the Cold War stayed cold, a positive outcome.
Right.
And today we have a failed war in Iraq, a failed war in Libya, Syria, and now this precipitous withdrawal from Afghanistan, and they are red flags to a bull. She is sitting there thinking, I'm going to carve up, I'm going to do exactly what I plan to do. So unless we wake up to the threat we face, then that increases the inevitability of the attempt by China, when the commodity cycle really goes into overdrive, to make its move.
The withdrawal from Afghanistan is, of course, making the US look particularly bad in that particular pilot war, though the Middle East in general is littered with military failures, and at the same time you have social unrest at home because unhappy with the conflict as a whole. Looking on how this reflects on the US as its, in its imperial status, and as you describe, an imperial status of decline, how does that play into markets when you're looking at the value of the US dollar and its status as global reserve currency?
Well, hegemons, at their peak seem untouchable. And if you go back to, the 90s, 2000, the Cold War had been vanquished.
Unipolarity.
And we lived in a world of a unipolar world. No one could ever imagine that America wasn't going to be at the top of that tree. So of course it could borrow from whoever it wanted. It could do what it wanted. And it had to go through a series of financial reversals to start to make the cracks, where exactly what happens in decline, which is it starts to move from a competitive economy to a reduced competitive economy with more leverage. So, let's just have a guess. 2003, we'll leverage ourselves 3 times and then we're going to look healthy. Bottom of 2008, we'll leverage ourselves 10 times and now that looks healthy. And by the end of the pandemic, let's leverage ourselves 40 times and look healthy.
Right.
And anyone who understands what a leverage portfolio does, it looks really healthy if you've got like 0.1% growth and 40 times the leverage because you make 40 units or 4% a month, and suddenly you don't because the 0.1 goes to 0 and the thing disappears. And that's exactly where America is. This highly leveraged system that people think is healthy, but is not healthy. And the speed at which the shift is going to take place, I think, is going to shock everyone. The erosion of the dollar has been going on for quite a while. And in fact, this the move that we are seeing at the moment is we've had one move down since those March 2020 lows. We're in a counter trend move at the moment, which all markets do. They don't go in a straight line. And as risk comes off, we'll see that counter trend movement reach its conclusion and peak. And then I think after that, somewhere in the next 3 months, when that peak is made, then we're going to start to move for a very, very big dollar decline. As America comes under pressure from all 3 of its asset classes, equity markets falling, bonds falling, and essentially the dollar falling because it's losing its reserve status. And I think that scenario is upon us within the next 12 months.
Considering how the dollar is used for commodity pricing, and of course dollar-denominated assets are seen somewhat as safe havens, so when we talk about US real estate and indeed US stocks to some degree, do you think what this dollar losing its value like that would lead to a rise in the price of those assets, like for example some commodities or real estate?
It's a bit more complicated than that. So imagine what's being created is this, I call it this giant super bubble, and it's a doomsday bubble because at the end of it there's no way out. And essentially, so much money has been printed in the past 12 months that it's gone everywhere into all aspects. And so people talk about the housing bubble, but the housing bubble's going. Lumber's already had its cycle. It went right to a peak high. No one spotted it. My work allowed me to predict the high, and it collapsed nearly 60% from that high. That means that the property asset cycle in the States is super vulnerable and just waiting to fall like everything else. We've seen it move into cryptocurrencies, which are really a response to the reserve status gradually being lost, or this sort of unconscious recognition it will be lost, and trying to fill the gap.
An externality.
Exactly right. What do you do when you lose the dollar? It's the beginning of that process, although it has all sorts of flaws, and it's also created a sub-bubble, which I think is going to work its way out of the system before it becomes actually, like gold and silver, possibly another whole surge. But we go down before we go up, as the whole implosion takes place. So you can see all the pieces in the puzzle already, and the other piece of the puzzle is rates. And essentially this zero rate environment is now on the move towards a much higher rate environment. And we've got 2 things happening. We've got systematic inflation, which has been suppressed. And a lot of that, when we should have seen inflation in the past 20 years, we have cheap manufacturing from China. I think with this Cold War dynamic accelerating, we have to discount the fact that that's not going to happen, and we're going to have to find other cheap manufacturing sources, and it's going to be expensive in the transition.
Yes.
That's a structural problem that people should be addressing and leaders should be addressing right now. For America, Mexico is the natural In fact, really, for the first world countries, they should be thinking about automated factories. If they're talking about infrastructural investment, it's to produce internal manufacturing that doesn't require transportation, doesn't expose you to your supply chains being cut off in times of conflict or constricted in places
during
like
a pandemic.
Exactly, the Suez Canal. You build things where you start. It's green, and also gives you control of your manufacturing base. So I think there is a whole revolution in the generation of new factories that build multitudes of things at the same time. And there should be a big focus on that. But before, we've got this big gap between what was made in China and where else do you make it. So there's inflationary dynamics from that. There's the first surge of commodity inflation from the lows in 2020, which is wave one of the surge. And I think we are at the peak of it. And when we have our asset bubble collapse, which is imminent right now, that will reduce demand and there will be a retracement. But we shouldn't be deluded in that case, whereas assets like shares and houses will just keep going down. Those guys represent core investment opportunities in 6 to 9 months' time. Not now, because over 5 years, I think commodity inflation is going to be unbelievable. And to give you some idea of the previous conflict relationships with the commodity cycle peak, 1914, World War I was the peak, or the peak of a commodity cycle. So no one talks about the fact that actually that war was about resources and the price of resources that triggered the actions. The next cycle peak was 75. And in 75, you had a Cold War paradigm. You had a consumer society in the West head on with a commodity producing society, Russia. And of course, their system looked economically incredibly viable in 1975 because they were producing commodities that were really valuable. And consumer society was doubly nobbled because it put input inflation and drag on their economies. And psychologically, we were losing in 75. It was an unwinnable war. And so that was interesting because you had a producer matched off against the consumer. And the spike wasn't as big as 14 on a relative basis. But the one in 25, you have two consumer societies head to head, and you have Russia on the side deciding which way it goes, which is another conversation. So I think this commodity price inflation spike is going to be like nothing we've seen before.
To give maybe